In late 2023, a single Nvidia H100 graphics card was selling for $70,000 on secondary markets in Singapore and Dubai. Not a server rack, not a full cluster. One card, small enough to hold in both hands, priced higher than a used Tesla. The engineers buying them were not black market operators. They were legitimate researchers at real labs who could not get allocation through official channels. And they paid anyway because the alternative was falling behind. That price was supposed to prove American leverage was absolute. It was actually the last moment American leverage was the whole story. The scarcity that was meant to be a ceiling became a forcing function. And the word that explains what happened next is one I want you to hold on to: inference. That is where this entire chain ends up, and it is not where anyone expected it to land. Here's the compressed version of what those $70,000 cards set in motion. American export controls restricted advanced chips to China. Chinese labs could not get the hardware. Chinese labs changed the engineering problem, and the new problem turned out to be more important than the old one. The United States Commerce Department tightened export controls on advanced chips in October 2022, and then again in 2023, targeting hardware above certain computational performance thresholds. The H100 fell well above those thresholds. Reports across trade and national security journalism suggested chips were transiting through third countries to reach restricted buyers, though the full scale of that has never been independently audited. What is documented is the price signal: $70,000 per card at the gray market peak. Stack 10 of them and you have roughly bought a house in a mid-size American city. Chinese labs needed hundreds. Think about what a pharmaceutical ban actually accomplishes. You restrict the export of a specific molecule. 6 months later, the target has learned to synthesize a different molecule that does the same job. The ban on the first molecule was entirely real. The assumption that the molecule was irreplaceable was not. That is the precise shape of what happened in compute. Chinese labs, including DeepSeek, published technical work showing competitive performance on public benchmarks using significantly fewer high-end computing hours than Western equivalents. The techniques were not secret: a mixture of experts' architectures, aggressive quantization, and inference time compute optimization. These are real methods with real published literature behind them. DeepSeek's own reported training costs for certain models were a fraction of comparable Western runs, though no independent audit of their training infrastructure costs has been published. The company claims are partially verified by peer review of the methods, not fully verified by external replication of the numbers. That distinction matters, and I will return to it. A chip cluster is like a highway. More lanes mean more throughput. What engineers working under constraint discovered is that most of the cars on that highway were empty. Efficiency work is carpooling. You do not need more lanes if you fill the ones you have. The remarkable thing is not that this insight existed. It is that the pressure to act on it was so much higher on one side of the export control line than the other. Optimization under constraint is an old story in engineering. What makes this case structurally different is where the optimization landed. Not primarily in training, where the hardware gap is genuinely hard to close, but in inference. Inference is the moment a model actually answers a question. Training is the expensive, hardware-intensive phase that happens once. Inference is what happens billions of times after that, at scale, in production, in front of users. Analyst estimates widely reported in the industry suggest inference compute costs overtook training as the dominant expense for most deployed applications as the field scaled. That shift was already underway. The export controls accelerated, which engineering culture was best positioned to exploit it. Huawei's Ascend line of chips, while reportedly behind Nvidia's Frontier hardware on raw training throughput, is reported to be more competitive on inference workloads per unit of power consumed. No independent head-to-head benchmark at production scale has been published, but the directional claim is consistent with what we know about the architecture choices made. The sanctions did not fail. They worked exactly as designed. What nobody modeled was that the target could change the objective. Match American capability on American hardware quietly became match American capability on whatever we have. Those are different engineering problems. China got assigned the harder one, which turned out to be the more important one. The policy held the line it was drawn to hold. It just did not hold the line that ended up mattering. There is an uncomfortable irony in the efficiency story that I do not think gets said plainly enough. Companies that had easy access to the best hardware had less incentive to optimize. Abundance is a tax on ingenuity. Reports suggest that several Western labs reduced efficiency research headcount or deprioritized it relative to scaling research during the period of H100 availability. That is directional, not a precise figure. But the logic is not complicated. If you can solve the problem by adding more compute, you add more compute. The discipline to make less, do more only emerges when less is all you have. Chinese labs paid a scarcity tax. It bought them something American labs did not purchase: the structural incentive to optimize inference until it was cheap enough to route around the hardware question entirely. Now the counterarguments, because they deserve full weight before any conclusion. First, benchmark parity on public tests is not capability parity on hard problems. Chinese labs have every incentive to publish favorable numbers. Western labs have every incentive to publicize the gap. Neither set of incentives produces clean ground truth. Second, the manufacturing node gap is real and physical. The most advanced fabrication processes are not available to Chinese chip fabs. The most advanced domestic node reportedly lags the global frontier by at least one generation, possibly two. For training very large next-generation models, that gap in transistor density translates to a capability ceiling that software optimization cannot fully close. The efficiency story is real. It is not infinite. Third, the efficiency figures that made headlines came from the companies themselves or from affiliated researchers. Some independent replication has come. Most has not. Weighed together honestly, the efficiency gains are structurally significant and documented at the methodological level. The capability parity claim is plausible for current generation tasks and unproven for next generation ones. The strategic reframe holds even if the strongest capability claims are discounted substantially. Hardware became less important at exactly the moment it became most expensive, and that is not a coincidence. I want to be precise about what I actually think happened here. The H100 export controls were not a mistake in conception. Restricting the most advanced training hardware was a rational play with a coherent theory behind it. The strategic error was assuming the task was fixed, that the only path to competitive artificial intelligence capability ran through that specific class of chip. Chinese labs demonstrated the task was not fixed. They changed the question from how do we get the best hardware to how do we make inference cheap enough that the hardware question becomes secondary. The second question turned out to matter more than the first. That $70,000 card sitting in a Singapore broker's inventory in 2023 is now a kind of historical artifact, proof that scarcity worked precisely as intended. Proof that it was not enough. The word I planted at the beginning was inference. That is where this lands. Not in the foundry, not in the training cluster, but in the moment a model answers a question, at scale, cheaply, on hardware that was not supposed to be good enough. The export controls shaped the research agenda of every lab that could not get allocation. And the agenda they produce is the one that now defines where the field is heading. The wall held. The map it drew turned out to be more useful than the territory it was meant to protect. The most consequential technology policy of the decade may have been the one that made Chinese engineers solve the problem that will define the next decade. If you were setting chip export policy today, knowing what we now know about the inference shift, would you draw the line in the same place or somewhere else entirely? I am genuinely curious where you land on that. Drop it below. And if this kind of structural breakdown is useful to you, subscribing is the only way the algorithm shows you the next one.